Hey, what's up, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in today's video. Today is a monumental day because I'm going to share with you for the first time ever my first complete gouache painting, and I have to thank the kind folk at MEEDEN for reaching out to me and offering to sponsor this video. They sent me a bunch of stuff, including their watercolor and gouache sets. Be sure to check out the links below and use coupon code Liron to apply the discount. And if you are keen, you may recognize that I have painted this scene, by the way, before. I painted a similar one of a different section of the bridge with different cars. This time, however, I captured the New York taxi in it, which is very important to tell our story. So first, let's unbox the set and then we'll get to the process. So first things first, let's look at these two sets. I actually received, again, both the watercolor and the gouache sets. Both have 24 tubes in them. I really like the packaging, as I'm a big fan of primary colors, as you may know. I also like how the tubes have a different design to them. You'll notice that the gouache set has this blocky pattern on the tubes, and the liquid drop design is for the watercolor set. Now, because I'm a total noob to gouache, and because I want to familiarize myself with both sets, I decided to use these plates as temporary palettes. That way, once I know what colors I love and enjoy most, I can create more permanent palettes for them. And during this process that you'll see in just a couple of moments, I indeed learned about a few colors that I'll be using a lot in the future. So here are the colors I will be using for this painting process. I chose a couple of tubes from each set. I'll be using watercolor and gouache pretty interchangeably, but the gouache will be the more dominant force of the two, especially as we progress through the painting. As for the scene we'll be painting, it's a fantastic view of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. And as you recall, I have painted a variation of this one before. I mentioned in the intro. I captured a very similar angle, but with a few different cars. And a couple of weeks ago, I went over some older photos and I discovered that I also had this one showing the orange taxi in it. Usually I'll go back and look at some old photos and figure out, okay, I really feel like painting this one there. I really love painting older scenes with a kind of new spin to them after I already painted them once. It puts a spotlight, I feel like, on how my results have changed and matured over time. With that, let's get to the process. I begin by painting the focal point directly. This is how I like to do it. So I'm starting with the yellow New York taxi. I like to get straight to the point, get the most interesting part of the painting done first. I'm just like that, very impatient. My plan is to start with some watered down gouaches and also watercolor, again, almost interchangeably. But as I progress, begin introducing thicker and thicker gouache, just pure gouache. Now, already in the beginning, you can see how much I enjoy varying the colors. It's clearly mostly yellow, but I support it with some other colors like that beautiful lilac-y blue. It's important to understand that light bounces off objects and onto other objects, and so all the elements of the scene are influenced by one another. The blue sky will reflect on the yellow car, for example. Sometimes this kind of a thing will lead to grays, other times you will just see visible, clean blues in there. And this all leads to very strong richness of color. The shadows here have some richness to them as well, which I personally adore in my painting subjects. I merged the taxi completely with the shadow on the ground. Perhaps I'll do a future process with a more opaque based approach right from the get, but as of now I'm a big fan of gouache because it can be watered down just like watercolor. So if anything, it gives me more choice if I want to work more opaquely or still maintain the flow. Note how the saturation also plays a role here. Some areas of the car are strongly saturated in yellow, while others are more muted in brownish. Once I complete this large area of the ground shadow, I merge it completely with the other car's shadow. This one is almost reversed. The car is mostly cool, but it does have a couple of touches of gentle warmth to it. I try and capture whatever nuance I can see in the body of the car with lots of the lilac color, some red and some neutral warm colors. The windshield here is the main attraction to me. It usually is, actually. And I painted it using a bright tropical blue. This will make it feel like strong sunlight is indeed hitting it. And once again, I established more of the big shadows in the scene, mostly on the ground. This shadow is also quite important as it will contrast with the car's lighter areas in their upper parts. I go for a strong brown, but I will later balance it out with some blues. I also darkened the shadow under the car to the left to hint at where the car ends and where the tires are and where the ground begins. I also used this opportunity of a first wash to establish the background. It is incredibly complex, so I choose to go with colors that cover the whole thing. The left section is cooler, and it then gets warmer the more we move to the center, and then it goes and becomes more neutral again towards the right side. And it's far easier for me to cover the whole thing up instead of trying to paint the smaller shapes, even though some people, when painting in gouache, may do that different kind of a process. Now, for now, the end result I get is an underpainting mess, I will admit, but later, once we add some darks and also lights, it will look fantastic. And I'm quite excited about adding highly opaque lights with gouache later, as there'll be a significant part of this process in differentiating mostly the details of the bridge and the background. As a final touch, I do add that shadow on the taxi's sign, and then I let everything dry some more. And I have noticed that the gouache dries much faster. It is now time for what I think is the most exciting part, which is the details on the cars. Just like how I started with the taxi, I like to continue that approach for the next wash. And being the impatient me, I'm diving directly into the darkest darks here. This will give me a better understanding of the range of values once again. Once I put in the darkest darks and I have some of the lights, I can fill in the in-betweens. Now, a word about gouache painting. I basically know nothing about it, I'm completely clueless, and I deliberately did not watch any videos, any how-tos, any guides or tutorials. I want to experience the medium for myself for the first time and find out how I personally enjoy using it. What I do know is that I can use it more opaquely, so I am painting this lovely yellow shadow color for the body of the car. It is quite opaque, as you may be able to tell. I wrap it around the existing darks and also then add more of the darks around the bottom of the car and the tires, which I love. It's a nice way of framing that yellow. And then the taillight gets a bit of warmth. Once I feel confident about the result, I make my way to the other car. This was the more challenging section for me to work on, and I'll show you why. But before we get to that, here's a reminder that this video is proudly sponsored by MEEDEN. I am featuring both their watercolor and gouache sets, with both having 24 tubes in them. You can find links to these in the description box below, as well as a general link to use with up to 10% off your purchase. MEEDEN has a wide variety of art supplies, from easels to brushes, paint, paper, and even storage solutions. I plan on checking out their paper and ceramic palettes next. So check them out in the description box below and use coupon code Liron to apply the discount. Thank you so much to MEEDEN for sponsoring this video. Let's continue with the process. So onto that second car, as I mentioned, gave me quite the challenge and actually felt like I'm sculpting it using lots of opaque small brush marks. This is something I'm less accustomed to, obviously, with me painting mostly with watercolors so far, so I found myself having to keep mixing different colors of different values to make the transitions look smoother, something that indeed comes a little more naturally with watercolor. In the future, I will be curious to experiment with adding water to gouache that is already on paper and seeing if I can help it blend more nicely, but for now I haven't even thought of doing that. When the time came to paint the windshield and details on the top of the car, it was much easier for me. These small areas are more manageable and more similar to how I would work in watercolor. One of the great pleasures of this process, by the way, has been to add beautiful opaque blues above darks, making them lighter, and the same for warm neutrals. I think this kind of an ability to layer lighter paint over darker is something I was missing a bit in pure watercolor. And now it was time for one of the more fun parts of the process, which is adding the bridge and the background. This is where the nature of the opaque gouache really came to the rescue, as you'll see later on. I'm starting by establishing some of the metal-made scaffolding and cables of the bridge. I honestly have no idea what these are and the exact role they play, but visually I find them beautiful. I'm having a bit of fun experimenting with different color temperatures. This honestly just took a lot of patience, just adding and adding more of the details. And there are far more details there than one realizes. A lot of letters, a lot of bolts, different shapes. I was already familiar with the general structure, thanks to the previous version I've painted of this scene, but it was still challenging. And I did try to maintain that interesting color temperature I mentioned before. As the painting progresses, I'm relying more and more on the gouache. While I'm at it, I'm starting to paint this structure close to the water. The background behind the bridge was the most challenging bit for me. How much attention should it have? How much of the details should I paint? You'll notice some of these details feel like they are almost above the bridge due to the opaque nature of gouache. This is something I'll alleviate later on when I go over the bridge once again and darken some of it. This is all new to me. I'm not used to painting over something and it looking like it's actually above that. And now it's time to add all the details on the right side. This was, from a background standpoint, the hardest part. More than the left side, I would say. Because I had to do a lot of simplification, I also used a lot of watercolors here just to make sure I don't lose some of the flow. I didn't want it to take too much attention from the bridge's details, so it was a real balancing act, because I did want to show enough of the background, but also not take away from the bridge. All I can do at the end of the day is observe the shapes and paint them as best as I can. And if you can treat them as mostly abstract shapes, you'll do pretty well. Now let's bring the focus to the cars in the front by darkening the shadow on the ground. I have been ignoring it for a while, but now it is time to paint it. I'm also using watercolor again to keep a minimal flow going. But notice just how much variety there is in that shadow. You can see tons of both warms and cools, and there's a lot of nuance. The unevenness of the wash bugged me a little, but we will fix it later. One thing this shadow does achieve is it gives meaning to the cars. They became objects that have volume and weight to them. Also, look at how much stronger and brighter the yellow of the taxi looks now in the context of being wrapped by darker shadows. Even the details on the hood suddenly pop. To me, this is when the painting starts to become more alive, and it gives me a better understanding of how much more information I can add to the background without taking away from the main focal point. It's time to start darkening the bridge's details and adding to it some of the details I have missed in the previous go. There's this lovely spiral ladder, probably used for maintenance, then almost everything else gets the darker treatment, though I do leave some hints of the light pouring through in the center. You'll often see this with thin, dark objects obstructing a light source. It's almost as if the light source pours through them and around them like a flow of water. It's a beautiful phenomenon I love capturing. And lastly, I spent quite some time on details. Details for the background, details on the cars themselves, and details within the shadow on the ground. I used this opportunity to smoothen out any unevenness in that shadow and darken some of the lights on the ground. This is all in preparation for what is arguably the most exciting part in the context of a gouache painting. Let's make full use of its opaque capabilities to add the highlights and fix our shapes. Just like with painting the initial details of the bridge, this also took quite a bit of patience. I am using the paint straight out of the tube, just out of habit. I could have also squeezed it into a plate and used it like I do the rest of them. I then go over every detail of the bridge that has lights that I painted over. And remember, this was mostly done in the process of painting that underpainting, that background in one go, if you recall. It was much easier to paint in one go, but it also meant I was painting over areas that I later will need to bring back the light to. One thing I enjoy doing here is varying up my whites. I mix them with some yellows, oranges, and reds to make them more interesting. When it comes to shapes, there are plenty of nuanced bits and pieces catching the light. These help to express the actual shape of the metal elements of the bridge, and there are some wonderful nuances there. I looked for anything in the reference photo that prominently sparkles, and I missed. Once I'm mostly happy with the bridge, I do the same for some of the details behind the bridge, including the water that has a lot of sparkles in it, and the cars on the highway, because notice the highway is not white, it does have some value to it, though it's still quite light. And also the industrial buildings to the right. These were as well a big key of these. But highlights don't have to be a bright white. I'm also adding much necessary reds and blues to the cars. And that's the advantage of using gouache here. Once I'm happy with that, it's time for that long tail ending stages of the painting. And the reason I call it a long tail is because now you can basically paint forever. You can continuously add and remove more details. There is always something to improve, but at some point, the painting reveals itself to me as done. So you've seen me in this section improving the details on the ground and on the cars, improving their flow, darkening some areas of them while maintaining interesting colors, adding darker spots to them. I'm also improving small details on the bridge by adding even darker darks. This helps me sculpt their true shape. I'm also painting these lovely bolts holding everything together and spending some time on the windshield, which is definitely, again, one of my favorite parts to paint of a car. Lots and lots of details. And this may seem tedious, but to me it's actually great fun because I'm slowly taking my painting closer and closer to my final vision. This is perhaps less exciting for the onlooker from those initial washes where every mark makes a strong statement. But funny enough, these tiny details we're adding right now will end up being the details that people notice and find impressive when observing the painting. What I personally find most impressive is actually the overall composition, the plan and the execution of the big shapes of the painting, the big colors, the big values. But not the viewers. This is exactly the gap between the painter's perspective and the observer's perspective. But then, as I mentioned, at some point, I look at what I have on paper and know it looks perfect. And when I get that feeling, that instinct, I stop. Yes, more details and improvement can always be added, but if it's perfect, it's perfect. And with that, I want to present to you my first ever complete gouache painting. I want to thank MEEDEN so much for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out the links below to receive up to 10% off your purchase. And lastly, I want to thank you because without you, none of this would have been possible. Thank you so much for the likes, the comments, just watching the videos, all the kind messages you send me. I really, really, really appreciate it. Keep creating, and I will see you in the next vid. Take care.